The storm had come without warning, as storms on Veridax Prime always did. One moment the sky blazed with 3 suns. The next it turned the color of old bruises, and the wind began to scream. Commander Zekthor of the Galactic Rescue Corps stood at the edge of the collapsed den, his forearms hanging uselessly at his sides. The massive rockslide had buried everything. Somewhere beneath tons of stone and twisted metal lay the breeding chamber of the last Catharian pride, a species teetering on the edge of extinction. The cubs, barely 3 weeks old, had no chance of survival. Even with their advanced equipment, his team would need days to excavate safely. Days the cubs didn't have. Commander, his second officer Lyra approached with her sensor array dimming to black. No life signs. The atmospheric pressure differential alone would have... I know. Zekthor cut her off, his translator barely managing to convey his grief. In his 70 cycles of service, he had saved thousands. But sometimes you arrive too late. The other members of the Pride, the parents, the elders, huddled together at a safe distance, their leonine faces masks of anguish. They knew. They had known from the moment the mountain decided to fall. The keening sound they made was universal, transcending species. It was the sound of hope dying. That's when they saw her. At first, she was just a shadow in the storm, a dark shape moving against the howling wind that had already forced Zekthor's team to anchor themselves with grappling lines. The figure stumbled, fell, rose again. As it drew closer, Zekthor's respiratory chambers seized. A human. They were rare this far out in the outer reaches, and their reputation preceded them. A species that had clawed its way from a death world, survived extinction events that would have ended any other civilization, and somehow convinced themselves they were ordinary. Zekthor had met a few. They were simultaneously terrifying and fascinating. This one was female, he thought, though humans were difficult to gender through their protective gear. She wore minimal environmental shielding, madness in the storm, and carried something clutched against her chest, wrapped in what appeared to be her own jacket. "Stop," Zekthor called out, his translator booming over the wind. "It's not safe. The ground is unstable." The human, Angel, her ID beacon identified her as, didn't stop. She didn't even slow down. She moved with a purpose that bordered on obsession, her boots finding purchase where his team's advanced hover tech had failed. She was heading directly for the collapse site. "Someone stop her," Lyra shouted. "She'll be killed." But no one could reach her. The storm intensified, and the human walked through it like it was nothing more than a summer breeze on her death world. Zekthor watched in horrified fascination as she reached the edge of the debris field and began to climb. "What is she doing?" one of his crew whispered. Angel climbed with a speed that defied logic. Rocks that should have been impossible to grip, gaps that should have been too wide, she navigated them all. And still she kept one arm wrapped protectively around whatever she carried. Twice the ground shifted beneath her. Twice she caught herself with reflexes that the Corps' best athletes would envy. Then Zekthor saw him, another human, emerging from the storm. This one was male, larger, moving with the same impossible determination. Casper, according to his beacon. He carried equipment Zekthor recognized. Human-make excavation tools, a medical pack, and what looked disturbingly like mountain climbing gear from ancient Earth. "Angel." Casper's voice cut through the storm, raw and desperate. "Angel, wait." She didn't wait. She was already at the collapsed entrance, already squeezing through a gap that Zekthor's instruments had measured as impassable. Her body contorted in ways that made his exoskeleton ache in sympathy, and then she disappeared into the mountain. "No," Zekthor breathed. "No, no, no." Casper reached the collapse site and without hesitation followed her in. "They're insane," Lyra stated flatly. "They're both insane. That's a death trap," Zekthor couldn't argue. The human homeworld had somehow produced a species that looked at death and shrugged. But he'd also heard stories. Humans who'd held failing reactors together with their bare hands. Humans who'd walked through radiation that would liquefy a Cranaxian. Humans who simply refused to die when any sensible species would have accepted the inevitable. Minutes passed like hours. The Catharian pride had gone silent, their eyes fixed on the mountain. The storm raged. Zekthor's team stood helpless, then, impossibly, movement. Casper emerged first, wedging his body into the gap to keep it open. And behind him came Angel. She was covered in blood, hers from the dozens of cuts that covered her exposed skin. Her left arm hung at an unnatural angle, but cradled against her chest, wrapped in her jacket, were three small shapes. The Catharian cubs. Alive. Angel stumbled, and Casper caught her. Together they made their way down the unstable debris, moving as one unit. When they reached stable ground, Angel fell to her knees and so carefully unwrapped her precious cargo. Three pairs of golden eyes blinked up at the storm. Three tiny mouths mewed weakly. The cubs were hypothermic, dehydrated, and in shock, but they were breathing. The pride exploded into motion, rushing forward. The mother reached Angel first, and for a moment Zekthor tensed, remembering that Catharians were predators twice a human's size. But the massive creature simply pressed her forehead against Angel's, a gesture of profound gratitude. Angel smiled through tears and pain. "Found them in an air pocket," she gasped. "Heard them crying through the rocks. Couldn't leave them." "Couldn't," Casper echoed, supporting her weight. "That's the key word with this one, Commander." She heard babies crying and turned off her sense of self-preservation. "I had self-preservation," Angel protested weakly. "I brought you, didn't I?" Zekthor watched as his medical team swarmed both humans. Angel's injuries were severe. Shock was setting in, while the Catharians tended to their cubs. He watched Casper refuse treatment until Angel was stable, watched Angel refuse sedation until she saw the cubs nursing from their mother. Humans, he decided, were absolutely mad. They felt too much, cared too deeply, and threw themselves at impossible odds with a smile and a shrug. They came from a world that had tried everything to kill them, and they'd survived by deciding that nothing, not physics, not probability, not common sense, would stop them from protecting the helpless. As the storm began to break and three suns emerged once more, Zekthor approached the humans. Angel was bandaged and sedated now, sleeping against Casper's shoulder. Casper looked up, exhausted but alert. "Why?" Zekthor asked simply. Casper looked down at Angel, then back at the Catharian pride where three small cubs wrestled weakly with each other, alive against all odds. "Because they needed someone," he said. "And we were here. That's enough." It was, Zekthor realized, the most human answer possible, and perhaps he thought that was why the galaxy needed them. Humans didn't calculate odds or measure risks against rewards. They heard someone crying in the dark and ran toward it, even through storms that gods would fear. They thought the cubs were gone. They thought hope was buried. They hadn't counted on humans.